Hello. My wife cheated on me and then tried to manipulate me into handing over everything I owned. Her parents even demanded the house and alimony, saying, "You owe us." Instead, I uncovered their fraud and watched their entire world collapse. My name is Colin. I am 36 and I work as a forensic accountant in Pittsburgh. My weeks are usually predictable: long hours during quarter close, early runs before work, dinner at home if I am lucky, and a life built around details most people miss. My wife is Vanessa, 34. We had been together 8 years, married for 5, and living in a house I bought 2 years before the wedding. No kids, one shared dog, joint checking for bills, separate savings, and what I thought was a stable routine until about 3 months ago. I am posting because I need outside perspective, and because now that I have the full picture, the beginning feels almost insulting in how obvious it was. Vanessa had always liked attention, but recently she turned sharp in a way that felt deliberate. Everything became a performance. If dinner was late because I got stuck at work, I was neglectful. If I worked from home, I was hovering. If I stayed quiet during one of her little speeches about how much she sacrificed for us, she would ask if I was too cheap to even defend myself properly. That was her style toward the end. Not loud all the time, just constant little cuts. The actual shift started when she began talking about a new client at her firm. She works in event marketing, and suddenly this guy named Adrian came up in every conversation. Adrian liked her ideas. Adrian said she was the only competent person in the office. Adrian needed her at late dinners with sponsors. Adrian needed her at weekend planning sessions. I am not a jealous person by default. My job would be impossible if I jumped to conclusions. But patterns are patterns. Then she changed her phone passcode. Started taking calls on the back patio even when it was freezing out. Bought new lingerie without mentioning it, and somehow never wore any of it around me. The final thing that made me stop rationalizing was small. She came home on a Thursday with a hotel keycard in her coat pocket. Not ours. Downtown boutique place. When I held it up, she did not look scared. She looked annoyed, like I had interrupted her. She told me I was spiraling and said the room was for a client block booking. Then she made herself a drink at 4 in the afternoon and asked whether I planned to interrogate her every time she had a successful week. So I did what I do for a living. I stopped arguing and started documenting. I copied bank statements. I pulled our credit card history. I checked mileage on her car against the places she claimed to be. Within 6 days, I knew she was lying. Within 10, I knew she was cheating. What I did not know yet was that finding the affair was actually the least expensive thing she planned to do to me. After I confirmed the affair, I expected the situation to follow a familiar script. Someone gets caught, there is denial for a few days, then anger, then negotiations about the future. I have seen similar patterns play out with friends. What I did not expect was how quickly Vanessa pivoted from hiding things to preparing something much bigger. At first, the new suspicion came from small inconsistencies that did not quite fit the cheating narrative. Affairs usually involve secrecy, impulsive decisions, and a lot of sloppy logistics. What Vanessa was doing felt more organized than that. For example, she suddenly started asking questions about the house that she had never cared about before. She wanted to know exactly how much I had paid for it originally. She asked whether my parents had contributed to the down payment. She also asked whether the mortgage paperwork still had only my name on it or if I had ever updated it after the wedding. The tone of those questions was not curiosity. It was almost like she was collecting talking points. Around the same time, she began making little comments that sounded rehearsed. She would say things like, marriage means everything becomes shared eventually. Or she would joke that if we ever split up, she would take the dog and half the house just to keep me humble. She always smiled when she said it, but the jokes came too often to feel casual. Then her parents suddenly started visiting more. Vanessa's parents live about 40 minutes outside the city, and before this they only came over every couple of months for dinner. Now they were stopping by almost every weekend. Her mother would wander through the house, making little remarks about improvements. Her father kept asking about property values in the neighborhood. One Sunday afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and heard the tail end of a conversation between Vanessa and her mother. The moment they saw me, they stopped talking. Vanessa immediately switched subjects and asked if I could pick up wine for dinner. That moment stuck with me longer than the cheating. So I expanded what I was tracking. Not just her movements anymore. I started paying attention to finances, documents, and conversations that suddenly seemed to revolve around assets. My job trains you to notice when someone is building a narrative in advance of a financial dispute. Within another week, I started seeing the outline of what Vanessa thought her exit plan was going to be. And that was when I realized the affair was only step one. Once I started paying attention to the financial side of things, the tone in the house became easier to read. Vanessa was no longer just distant. She was positioning herself. The first sign was the joint account. We had always used one checking account for household expenses: mortgage, utilities, groceries, vet bills for the dog. Everything else stayed separate. That system had worked fine for years. Neither of us had ever tried to push the boundaries on it. Then suddenly Vanessa began suggesting changes. She said it would be more efficient if we consolidated more of our finances. According to her, couples who plan long-term should operate from a single shared structure. She framed it like a maturity conversation, like I was the one holding the marriage back by keeping my savings separate. Normally that might have sounded reasonable, but it landed differently once I knew she was seeing someone else. So instead of arguing, I asked questions. I asked why she wanted to merge accounts now when we had been fine for 8 years. I asked why she was suddenly concerned about efficiency when she had never once looked at our budget spreadsheets before. Her answers were vague. She talked in generalities about trust and partnership, but never addressed the timing. That alone was suspicious. But the bigger issue came 2 days later. I received a notification from our bank that Vanessa had tried to increase the daily transfer limit on the joint account. It was not approved automatically because the account required both owners to confirm changes above a certain threshold. When I asked her about it that evening, she shrugged and said she was just trying to make bill payments easier. That explanation made no sense. Our bills were automated. Nothing required large transfers. Increasing the limit would only matter if someone planned to move a lot of money quickly. I did not accuse her of anything. Instead, I simply declined the request through the banking app. That was the moment her attitude shifted. She stopped pretending the financial conversation was casual. Over the next few days, she began dropping comments about how unfair it was that the house was legally mine because I had purchased it before the wedding. She said marriage should not be about technical ownership. She said a judge would probably see it her way anyway. The strange part was how confident she sounded. Not hopeful, not speculative, confident. And that confidence started to make a lot more sense the night her parents invited us to dinner, and her father raised a glass and said something I had never heard before. He looked straight at me and said, "We are family now, Colin. What is yours is ours too." At the time, it sounded like a strange toast. Later, I realized it was not a toast at all. It was a preview. That dinner at Vanessa's parents' house changed the tone of everything. Until then, I had been treating the situation like a private marital problem. An affair, some financial maneuvering, a possible divorce coming. Unpleasant, but manageable. After that dinner, I started to realize they had already built an entire story about how this was going to end. Her parents live in a large house outside the city, the kind bought 20 years ago before property prices went insane. Vanessa grew up there, and they have always been protective of her, sometimes to an unhealthy degree. Even small arguments between us used to get reported to them. That night felt different, though. Less emotional, more strategic. Dinner started normal enough. Her mother talked about gardening. Her father complained about property taxes. Vanessa stayed unusually quiet and kept checking her phone. But halfway through the meal, her father leaned back in his chair and started asking questions about my finances. Not casual ones. He asked about the house again. He asked how much equity I had built since buying it. Then he asked whether I had updated the deed after Vanessa and I got married. I answered calmly because there was no reason not to. The house was purchased by me before the wedding and the title had never changed. He nodded like he had expected that. Then he said something that immediately made the entire conversation feel coordinated. He said marriages are partnerships and courts usually see property differently once a couple has lived in it together for years. Vanessa finally spoke up then. She said she had been reading about marital assets and how judges divide things fairly when one partner tries to keep everything. The phrasing stood out. Try to keep everything. That was not an accidental choice of words. I finished dinner politely, and we drove home without much conversation. Vanessa acted like nothing unusual had happened. She even complained about traffic on the highway like it had been a completely ordinary evening. But once we got home, I sat in my office and replayed the entire conversation in my head. Between the affair, the sudden focus on finances, the attempted transfer limits, and now her parents openly discussing property division, a pattern was forming. They were not reacting to a breakup. They were preparing for one. And they seemed very confident that when it happened, I would be the one walking away with nothing. What they did not know was that my job revolves around identifying financial lies. And over the next week, I started noticing details that had nothing to do with the affair at all. Once I accepted that Vanessa and her parents were planning something bigger than just a divorce, I stopped reacting emotionally and started approaching it like an investigation. That is the advantage of my job. When something feels off financially, I do not argue about it. I gather information until the structure becomes visible. The first thing I reviewed carefully was our financial history over the last year. I already knew about the affair-related expenses. Hotel charges, certain restaurants downtown, rideshare trips late at night. That part was messy but predictable. What caught my attention was something else. Vanessa had quietly started moving money months earlier. Not from the joint account. That would have been obvious. Instead, she had been transferring small amounts from her personal account into an account I had never seen before. The transfers were always just under the reporting thresholds that banks tend to flag for review. Not illegal, but very deliberate. At first, I assumed it was just savings she had not mentioned. But then I noticed the name on the receiving account. It was not hers. It belonged to a small consulting company. And the name of the registered owner of that company was her father. That alone would not normally mean much. Families move money around for all sorts of reasons. But the pattern became clearer when I looked deeper. Over the previous 9 months, Vanessa had transferred a total that added up to nearly $80,000. Every payment labeled consulting services. Vanessa does not run a consulting business. She works for a marketing agency on salary, which meant those transfers had no legitimate explanation. At that point, I started checking public records. Her father's consulting company had been registered less than a year ago. Around the same time, Vanessa began complaining more about how unfair our financial arrangement supposedly was. Even more interesting was the fact that the company had never reported any employees or real business activity. On paper, it existed. In reality, it looked like a funnel. And suddenly a lot of things started to make sense. If Vanessa filed for divorce while claiming limited savings, but the money had quietly been moved to a company controlled by her father, then it would look like she had fewer assets to divide. Meanwhile, they would push aggressively for the house, alimony, and anything else they could frame as marital property. In other words, they were preparing to strip my side of the ledger while hiding their own. What they apparently forgot was one simple problem. You should never try to build a financial scheme around someone who audits fraud for a living. Once I confirmed what Vanessa and her father were doing, I had two choices. I could confront them immediately and watch them deny everything, or I could document the entire structure properly so there would be no room for them to twist the story later. I chose the second option. The first step was gathering proof that the consulting company was not legitimate. Public records already showed that the company had no employees and almost no reported activity, but that alone would not be enough. Plenty of small businesses operate quietly. What mattered was the connection between Vanessa's transfers and the timing of everything else. So I built a timeline. 9 months earlier, her father registered the consulting company. 2 weeks later, Vanessa began sending monthly payments labeled consulting services. At the same time, she started pushing the idea that our finances needed to become more shared. A few months after that, she began talking about how unfair it was that the house was legally mine. And right around the same time, the affair with Adrian started. Once the pattern was clear, the intention behind it became obvious. The affair was not just reckless behavior. It created emotional conflict that could justify a divorce later. Meanwhile, the money transfers quietly moved her savings into an account controlled by her father. On paper, she would appear to have far less money than she actually did. Then came the part that made their plan collapse. Because my job requires compliance reviews, I am familiar with how financial institutions flag suspicious patterns. Those $80,000 in payments labeled consulting services would normally require documentation if they were examined closely. Invoices, contracts, proof of work performed. So I requested copies of the supposed consulting invoices directly from Vanessa's father's company email. I did it using a simple message that looked like routine verification connected to my work. He sent them within 2 hours, and they were terrible. The invoices listed vague services like strategic advisory and operational insight. No dates, no project descriptions, no measurable deliverables, just round numbers that matched the exact transfers Vanessa had made. Anyone who reviews financial fraud cases could recognize it immediately. It was not consulting. It was money being parked somewhere else. And once I had those invoices saved, their entire plan stopped being a divorce strategy. It became financial fraud that was now fully documented. At that point, I had enough evidence to prove what Vanessa and her father were doing. The transfers, the fake invoices, the timeline. But exposing it immediately would have been a mistake. If they realized I had figured it out, they would simply adjust the story. So instead I waited. About 2 weeks later, Vanessa finally made her move. It happened on a Monday evening after dinner. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with a calm expression that looked rehearsed. Then she told me she thought our marriage had become unhealthy and that we should consider separating. The delivery was almost clinical. She said we had grown apart. She said my work made me distant. She said she deserved a partner who supported her emotionally. I listened without interrupting. Then she introduced the real topic. She said that since we had built a life together, it would only be fair if we divided things in a way that respected her contributions. She mentioned the house almost immediately. According to her, even though I had purchased it before the marriage, the years we spent living there together meant she had earned a share. That was when her parents entered the picture. 2 days later, Vanessa told me they wanted to discuss the separation like adults. Apparently, they believed family conversations were better than involving lawyers right away. I agreed to meet them. We sat in their living room that Saturday afternoon. Vanessa beside her mother, her father in the chair across from me. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes before the real demand came out. Her father leaned forward and said something that sounded less like a suggestion and more like an instruction. He said that since Vanessa had supported the household emotionally for years, the fair outcome would be simple. I would transfer the house to her, provide monthly support while she re-established herself, and split any remaining assets evenly. Then he smiled and said the sentence that stuck with me. He said, "You owe us for the years she invested in you." They genuinely expected me to agree. Instead, I pulled a folder out of my bag and placed it on the coffee table. Inside were the bank records, the transfer logs, and every invoice her father had emailed me from his consulting company. And for the first time since this whole situation started, Vanessa stopped looking confident. The room went quiet the moment I opened the folder. Vanessa looked down first. Her father tried to keep his expression neutral, but I could see the moment he recognized the invoice format on the top page. He knew exactly what he was looking at. I kept my voice calm because there was no reason to raise it. I explained the timeline. I showed them the company registration date. Then I placed the bank transfer records on the table one by one. Every payment Vanessa had sent to his consulting company was there, lined up month by month. Her mother started asking what this was supposed to prove. So I explained it very simply. I said the invoices had no project descriptions, no contracts, and no documented work. I pointed out that Vanessa's job had nothing to do with consulting services. Then I showed them the total amount that had been transferred, just under $80,000. Vanessa tried to interrupt and say it was private family business, but that argument collapsed immediately once I reminded them of something important. Those payments had been labeled as business services, which meant if they were not legitimate services, they were false financial documentation tied to tax reporting. That was when her father finally spoke. He tried to shift the conversation back to the divorce. He said couples sometimes move money around before separation and that courts understand financial preparation. That was when I closed the folder. Then I told him the part he had clearly not considered. I said I was not interested in arguing about property anymore. The house was already protected legally because I purchased it before the marriage. But the financial transfers were now documented, and the invoices he sent me were stored in multiple places. If Vanessa filed for divorce and tried to claim limited assets while $80,000 sat inside his consulting company, that information would appear during financial disclosure. And if the paperwork was reviewed closely, the fake invoices would become a very different kind of problem. For the first time since this started, Vanessa looked genuinely nervous. Her father did not argue anymore. He just stared at the documents on the table like he was calculating how quickly things had gone wrong. The meeting ended about 5 minutes later. No one asked for the house again, and that was the moment their entire plan started collapsing. After that meeting, everything moved much faster than I expected. Vanessa did not come home that night. Around midnight, she sent a short message saying she was staying at her parents' house and that we needed to talk about ending the marriage. The tone was noticeably different from before. There were no more comments about what I supposedly owed her. Just a short sentence saying we should handle things like adults. The next morning, I contacted a divorce attorney and explained the entire situation. I brought the documentation with me. The bank transfers, the invoices from her father's consulting company, the timeline I had built. My lawyer did not even try to hide his reaction. He said the house was already clearly protected since I purchased it before the marriage. But the financial transfers were something Vanessa would absolutely not want examined in court. which meant the negotiation leverage had completely flipped. Within a week, Vanessa's attorney reached out. The proposal was very simple. They wanted a fast, uncontested divorce. No fight over the house. No request for alimony. No attempt to divide my personal savings. The only thing they asked was that the joint checking account be split evenly and that both sides move forward without digging into extended financial discovery. My lawyer looked at me and said the same thing I had already realized. They were trying to end this before their paperwork became a problem. So I agreed. The paperwork moved quickly after that. Since we had no children and very few shared assets, the process was mostly procedural. A few forms, a short hearing, and a judge confirming that both sides accepted the terms. Vanessa barely looked at me during the hearing. Her parents were not there. About 6 weeks after that first meeting in their living room, the marriage was legally over. No house transferred. No alimony. No dramatic courtroom arguments. Just a clean divorce that looked surprisingly quiet on paper. But the real collapse of their plan did not happen in the courtroom. It started afterward, when the financial details they tried to hide began catching up with them anyway. After the divorce was finalized, I expected things to simply fade out. Legally, everything was done. Vanessa moved the rest of her belongings out of the house over 2 weekends while I was at work. We barely spoke during that time. The dog stayed with me, which honestly surprised me since she had always claimed she was more attached to him. But the strangest part was how quickly her entire family disappeared from my life. For years they had been involved in everything. Holidays, weekend dinners, random visits where her father would walk around the house commenting on repairs I should make. Then suddenly there was nothing. No messages. No last attempts at negotiation. Just silence. At first I assumed they were simply relieved the divorce ended quietly. That would have been the smartest outcome for them. Once the paperwork was signed, there was no reason to keep pushing anything. But the financial mess they created did not disappear just because the marriage ended. About 2 months later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance who worked in accounting at a regional firm. He mentioned that Vanessa's father had been dealing with some serious tax problems involving a consulting company he registered the previous year. Apparently, the numbers did not match the business activity he had reported. Large transfers labeled as consulting income. No real clients. No documentation that held up under review. I never asked for details, and he did not volunteer many. But the implication was obvious. When financial records start getting examined closely, poorly constructed paperwork does not survive very long. Vanessa and her parents had spent months building a plan that assumed I would panic, hand over the house, and try to escape the conflict quickly. Instead, they ran that plan against someone whose entire career revolves around recognizing financial manipulation. The house is still mine. My finances are intact. The dog still sleeps on the same spot near the living room window every night. Vanessa is gone, and honestly, that part feels quieter than I expected. The strange thing is that if they had simply ended the marriage honestly, the entire situation probably would have been simple. But the moment they decided I owed them everything, they created a problem they could not control. And once I saw the structure of it, the outcome was never really in doubt. Bye-bye.